The road grader sat dead in the dark with its lights still burning, and Wendell Pruitt stood beside the open cab door with one boot on the step and one in the gravel, listening to a quiet that had no business being there. It was 4 minutes past 2 in the morning by the dash clock. He had cut a clean pass down the south shoulder of Fenwick Road 40 minutes earlier, blade set low, windrow neat behind him, and he had turned at the cattle guard to come back north. The engine had stalled on the turn. That happened sometimes with the old machine, when the fuel filter loaded up. He had restarted it twice, and it had caught both times, and died both times. And now it would not catch at all, and the silence that came in behind the stopped engine was the thing he could not explain. That was the first wrong thing, and he noticed it the way he noticed a tire going soft by feel. Before fact, Fenwick Road ran past the Mechlin Slough, and the slough in late spring should have been a wall of sound thick enough to lean on. He had graded that stretch every spring for 19 years, and the frogs had never once stopped for him. They stopped now. He stood with his hand on the cold metal of the door, and he counted, because counting was what he did when a thing did not add up, and he got to 30, and there was nothing. Not a frog, not a cricket, not the small rustle of a field mouse in the ditch grass. The slough had gone as still as a hell breath. Wendell was 53 and he did not spook. He had pulled drowned calves out of that slough, and he had worked the road through 3 ice storms and a flood year, and he had never once called in sick for anything he could not see. He kept the county's 2 graders running past what their hour meters said they had any right to give. He carried a grease pencil behind his ear and a notebook in his chest pocket, and he wrote down what he saw, dates and depths and the mile markers where the frost heaved worst, because a man who wrote things down did not have to argue with anybody later. He did not invent stories. He did not embroider. When his wife asked how his day went, he told her the truth. And the truth was usually short. Lila had married him at 26, knowing exactly the kind of man she was getting. A man who would never surprise her with a word he had not weighed first, and in 27 years he had not surprised her once, which she said was both the best and the most aggravating thing about him. They kept a small place on the north edge of the county, a house his father had wired, and a barn Wendell had roofed himself the summer. His knees first started talking back, and Lila kept a garden and a few hens and a line of laundry that she hung out even in March because she said the cold made the sheets smell like nothing else would. He thought about the laundry line sometimes on the long passes, the white sheets snapping in a wind, because it was the cleanest picture he had of the life the road paid for. They had no children. They had wanted them, and the children had not come, and they had made their peace with it, the way they made their peace with weather, by not arguing with a thing that would not change, and the absence had drawn the 2 of them closer rather than apart, so that the house was quiet but not empty. Nothing like the quiet that was sitting on Fenwick Road. Now he reached into the cab and pulled the radio off its hook and keyed it. The county night line was supposed to be staffed until 3. He gave his unit number and his location, and he waited. And the radio gave him back a wash of static, with a shape under it, the kind of carrier hum that means the channel is open and nobody is there. He keyed it twice more. Nothing answered. He set the radio on the seat and left it keyed, so the open channel filled the cab with its low hiss, because a sound he understood was better than the silence outside, and he stepped down into the gravel to look at his machine. The headlights threw 2 cones of yellow down the road and lost them in the dark past 60 feet. The blacktop had given out a mile back, and Fenwick was gravel from there to the slough, Gravel he had laid and crowned and maintained himself, and he knew every soft spot in it. He walked to the front of the grater and crouched and looked at the fuel bowl with the light of his headlamp, and the filter was clean, and the bowl was full, and there was no reason on God's earth the engine should not turn over. He stood up slow with his knees, telling him about the cold. That was when he smelled it. It was not a smell he had a word for, and Wendell had words for most smells a country road could offer. He knew the sweet rot of a deer gone over in a ditch in August, and the ammonia bite of a fox den, and the green stink of slough mud turned over by a backhoe. And he could tell a skunk that had sprayed from a skunk that had only been killed, and none of those was this. It was wet and rank and close, something between a deer carcass 3 days in the sun and the inside of a dog's mouth, and under that a sharp note like a cellar that flooded and never dried. It got into the back of his throat and stayed there. It came from the slough side, from the dark beyond the headlight throw, and it came in on no wind, because there was no wind. The air sat dead flat. He stood with his back to the warm engine block, and he breathed through his mouth, and he made himself think it through the way he thought everything. Through something had died in the slough, the smell carried on the damp. That was all. He believed that for about as long as it took to say it to himself, which was not long, because a dead thing does not smell like a wet thing breathing, and this smell moved, it came and it thinned, and it came again, the way a smell only moves when the thing making it moves. He got back in the cab and shut the door, and he did not feel safer with it shut, only smaller. He tried the starter again, and the solenoid clicked, and the engine ground a half turn and quit, and the battery light flickered red, and he took his hand off the key. The dash clock said 2:13. He picked the radio back up and keyed it, and said his unit number again. Slower, and the static came back at him. And then under the static, for just a moment, there was a sound that was not static. A low pulse, a rumble down at the bottom of what the speaker could carry, with a second thing riding on top of it. A faster catch and release, like two sounds made by one source that could not quite hold them together. It was on his channel. It came through the speaker. Then it was gone, and the static closed back over the place where it had been. He sat very still. He told himself it was interference, a truck CB3 valleys over a skip off the clouds. He had heard skip before, voices from 4 states away, ghosting in on a still night. This had not been a voice. He set the radio down, and he reached up and turned off the cab dome light so he could see out, and he waited for his eyes to come back, and he watched the place where the headlight cones died on the gravel ahead. Nothing moved out there for a long time. The frogs did not come back. He checked the clock at intervals. He did not mean to keep, and it crawled. 2:17, 2:21. He had a thermos of coffee, and he did not drink it. He had a quarter tank of diesel, and a dead engine, and a radio that would not raise the county. And he had the smell coming and going through the firewall of the cab as if the thing that made it was circling at the edge of the light. And he made himself sit and watch and not give the dark anything to chase. At 2:34 something crossed the road. He did not see it whole. He saw the headlights change, the way they change when a hand passes in front of a flashlight, a darkness that moved through the beams from the slough side to the ditch on the north. And it was tall enough that the cones did not light the top of it. The light caught a leg. One leg, planted in the gravel for the length of a single stride, and the leg was wrong. It bent the wrong way at the joint, the way a dog's hind leg bends, but it was long, longer than a man's whole body, and it was covered in something dark and matted, that the light did not shine off the way wet fur shines. Then the stride finished, and the darkness was across, and the light was just light again. 2 yellow cones with nothing in them. The whole thing took less than a second. He sat with his hands flat on his thighs, and he did not move, and he heard his own heart going. And he counted it because counting was what he had. He did not tell himself it was a deer. He had wanted to. He could feel the want of it, the way you want a rational thing to be true so the night can go back to being a night. Wendell had jacklighted deer off that very road for 30 years, and he knew the green coin of a deer's eye in a beam, and he knew the high tick of a deer's run, and that had not been a deer. And a man who wrote down depths to the quarter-inch could not make himself write down deer. He wrote down what he had seen. He took the grease pencil from behind his ear, and the notebook from his pocket, and in the red wash of the battery light, he wrote the time in one line, crossed N to S leg, bent back like a hound, taller than the cab. He looked at the line, and he did not cross it out. The cab of a road grader sits high, higher than a pickup, and the door is a long step down. He thought about that. He thought about the mile of gravel between him and the blacktop, and the 4 miles of blacktop between the blacktop and town. And he thought about his own legs. 53 years old with the knees they had, and he did the arithmetic the way he did all arithmetic. Flat and without hope of a better answer. He was not going to outwalk the thing he had just seen cross 30 yards of road in under a second. He was going to sit in the cab where the metal was, between him and it. And he was going to wait for the county to send somebody when he did not check in. And he was going to keep the radio keyed and his eyes open and his hands still. The county did not send anybody. He understood sitting there that they might not. The night man on the desk was a kid named P.D. Voss, who ran the county's after-hours line out of a trailer behind the shop. A good-natured boy who played a handheld game most of the night and answered the radio when it crackled, and otherwise let the dark take care of itself. Petey would see his unit logged out and assume he was working a long pass, and the long passes ran till 4 sometimes. And nobody would think a thing about Wendell Pruitt being quiet on the radio because Wendell Pruitt was a quiet man on the radio. He had built that reputation himself, the man who did the work and did not chatter. And now the reputation was a wall he was sitting behind alone. He keyed the radio anyway. He said his unit number, and he said he had a mechanical. And he said the location twice, and he made himself say it plain and steady. Because a man who panicked on the radio was a man nobody believed, and he needed to be believed later. He thought about the wording even as he said it, the way he thought about everything. And he gave Petey nothing about a smell or a sound or a crossing, only a dead engine on Fenwick. Because a dead engine would bring a tow at first light, and a story about a crossing would bring nothing but a note in a file that said Pruitt had gotten strange. Out there in the dark. The smell came strong again at 2:41, and this time it came with a sound he felt in the floor of the cab before he heard it in his ears. It was the rumble from the radio, the low pulse, but it was not in the radio now. It was outside, it was under the machine, and the second sound rode on top of it, the catch and release, faster now, closer. And the two of them together made a thing that the inside of his chest answered to before his mind could. He had felt a diesel idle rough, and he had felt a freight train pass a crossing close, and this was neither. This was a sound made by a throat, or by 2 throats, working in one chest, and it was directly below the floor of his cab, in the dark, under the machine where the warm oil pan was, and it stopped. It stopped the way a thing stops when it has heard you hold your breath. He did not breathe. He sat with the grease pencil still in his hand, and he looked at the door handle, and he looked at the lock, the little chrome post standing up out of the door panel, and he reached over slow and pressed it down with one finger, and the click of it seemed loud enough to carry to the slough. Nothing answered the click. The sound under the machine did not start again. He sat with his fingers still on the lock post, and he waited, and the minutes went 2:45, 2:49, and the smell thinned, and the floor under his boots stayed quiet, and he let himself believe for a moment that it had moved off. Then the machine rocked. It was a small thing, and it was the worst thing. The grater weighed 13 tons, and it did not rock for wind, and it did not rock for a man climbing the step. It rocked the way a parked truck rocks when something heavy leans against the bed and tests its give. A slow press and release on the rear of the frame behind the cab, where he could not see. He turned in the seat and looked back through the rear glass, and the work light over the ripper was on, and it lit the raised ripper teeth and the gravel behind, and there was nothing there that the light could find. The machine pressed down again on the back left, a long, steady lean, and he watched the rear of the cab tilt and felt the seat tilt under him, and whatever was doing it was below the reach of the work light, down at the frame, and it was strong enough to move 13 tons on its springs and patient enough to do it slow. He thought about the things a man keeps in a county grater: a grease gun, a 4-pound hammer, a pry bar in the side box that he could not reach without opening the door, a flare kit under the seat. He did not have a gun. He had never once in 19 years needed a gun on that road, and he had one at home in the closet, and it was 4 miles and a mile of gravel away. He pulled the flare kit out from under the seat and set it on his lap, and he did not open it. A flare was light, and the thing outside did not seem to like light. It had stayed below the lights and behind them, but a flare was also a fire in his hand inside a cab with a diesel tank under him, and he was not a man who did a reckless thing because he was afraid. He set the flares on the dash where he could reach them, and he kept his hands free. The leaning stopped. The smell pulled back. For 11 minutes by the clock, there was nothing, and the nothing was its own kind of pressure, because he knew now that it was not gone, it was deciding. He sat with the flares on the dash and the hammer not yet in his hand, and he watched the second hand of the dash clock sweep its slow circle, and he made himself breathe the way he breathed when he was working a culvert that might let go under the machine, slow and even, and from the bottom of the chest. He had read enough sign in his life to know the difference between an animal that wandered through and an animal that was working a problem. A coyote that finds a fence works the fence. A bear that finds a cooler. He had watched a black bear at a dumpster. Behind the shop one fall spend 40 minutes learning a slide bolt that a man had bolted on to stop exactly that. And he had watched the bear win, and what he remembered was not the bear getting in, but the patience of it, the way it had tried a thing and stopped and tried another. Never hurried, never angry, just working. This thing had found a man in a steel box, and it was working the box, testing the give of the frame, learning where the light reached and where it did not. Going quiet when he went quiet, and that was not the behavior of a thing that was hungry and dumb. That was the behavior of a thing that was patient and was not. At 3 o'clock, the radio spoke. Not the county. The static shifted, and the rumble came through it again. The layered sound, the two-throated thing, and this time it held longer, 4 seconds, 5. Filling the cab from the speaker, while the same sound, the very same, came faint and outside. The two of them slightly out of time with each other, like an echo that arrived from the wrong direction. He understood in a cold, flat way that did not feel like fear, because it was past fear. It had found the frequency the way it had, found the frame. He did not know how, and he did not try to know how. He reached up and turned the radio off, and the cab went silent except for his own breathing. And outside the sound went on a moment longer in the dark, and then it too stopped, and the matching of it was the worst thing he had heard in his life. He sat in the dark with the radio dead and the engine dead and the dome light off. And he watched the road, and he made himself go back through it like a checklist, because the checklist was the only floor he had left. Frogs gone at 2:09, smell at 2:10, sound on the radio at 2:13. The crossing at 2:34, north to south, leg bent like a hound, taller than the cab. The lean on the frame. He laid the facts down one at a time, like he was setting fence posts, and he looked at the line they made, and the line did not lead anywhere. A rational man wanted to go. He had spent his whole life trusting that if you gathered enough true things, they would add up to an answer you could live with. He gathered them now, and they added up to a thing he had no name for, and did not want one, a thing that was wrong for that road and somehow perfectly fitted to it, that knew how to go quiet and how to lean and how to find a channel that was out there, in the dark doing arithmetic of its own. Dawn was 3 hours off. He knew the country, and he knew the light, and he knew that the sun would come up over the Mechlin Ridge at 5:40 and would not reach the slough bottom till near 6, and that the longest dark of the night was still ahead of him. He checked the door lock with his finger. Again he moved the flares an inch closer. He took the 4-pound hammer out from under the seat, the only thing in the cab he could swing, and he set it across his knees. And he knew it was not enough, and he held it anyway, because a man holds what he has. The thing came back at 3:19. He heard it before the smell this time, a sound up high on the cab, on the roof a settling weight, and then the long scrape of something drawn slow across the steel above his head. 4 lines. He could hear the 4 of them, evenly spaced, deliberate, the sound of something with 4 points pressed down and pulled back. Not a branch, not a wind-blown thing. 4 parallel draws across the roof of the cab directly over where he sat. The sound went through the steel and into his teeth, a hard, bright scrape with a give in it where the metal flexed under the weight, and he could hear in it the same thing he had seen in the prints, claws that pushed in past where they should stop. He looked up at the headliner, and he did not move, and the scrape went the length of the roof and stopped at the rear, and there was a silence, and then it came again from the front. The same 4 lines, the same even spacing, drawn the other way. It was on top of the machine. It had climbed 13 tons of steel, without a sound until it wanted sound. And now it wanted him to hear it, and it was telling him with 4 lines on the roof exactly where it was, and exactly how little the steel meant. He had set 1,000,000 scratches into 1,000,000 pieces of equipment over the years, and he knew a thing made by accident from a thing made on purpose. And this was made on purpose, slow, twice, in 2 directions, like a man signing his name where another man would see it. He thought of his wife, Lila, asleep at home, with the window cracked the way she liked it, 4 miles off and a mile of gravel. And he thought of the closet and the gun in it, and how far away the gun was. And he thought, with a clarity that was almost peace. The worst thing was that the thing on the roof had learned the machine the way he had learned the road, every soft spot and every blind reach, and that when it was done with the machine, it would go looking for the next thing to learn. And the next thing down Fenwick Road was the slough, and past the slough was the county, and past the county was the town, and the houses in it with their windows cracked, the way Lila liked them. He sat under the 4 lines, and he understood that he was not the point. He was the lesson. And the lesson was being taught patiently on the roof of a grater in the dark by something that was in no hurry at all. The weight shifted on the roof, a long redistribution, and then the cab pitched as the thing came down off the back. A drop he felt in his spine, and the machine settled hard on its springs and was still. He turned and looked out the rear glass into the wash of the work light, and for 1/2 of 1 second, the light found it. It stood at the edge of the work light's throw with its back to him, and it was upright on 2 legs, and the legs bent backward at the joint like a hound's hind legs, and carried it taller than the raised ripper, taller than the cab, and the back of it was a long ridge of matted dark hair, done narrow at the waist and heavy at the shoulder, and the head turned, just the head, back over the shoulder toward the light. And the work light cut 2 points of amber, low in the dark of the face, steady levels set wide apart, not startled, not caught, measuring. Then it stepped out of the light, and the work light had nothing in it but gravel and the raised teeth of the ripper in the dark beyond, and Wendell let his breath out slow through his mouth and wrote nothing down, because some things a man does not need a notebook to keep. He sat the rest of the night with the hammer on his knees, and the flares on the dash, and the door locked and the radio off, and the thing did not come back to the roof or the frame, but it did not leave either. He could feel it out there, the way you feel a storm, sitting on a ridge, a pressure that does not move and does not break. The smell came and went. Twice more he heard the layered sound, far off in the slough, the rumble and the catch riding on it, and twice he did not move. He watched the clock crawl through the bottom of the night. 3:40, 4:10, 4:40, and the dark stayed total, and the frogs did not come back, and he kept his hands free and his eyes on the road, and he did the only thing 19 years on that road had truly taught him, which was to outlast a bad night by refusing to give it anything. The sky began to gray at 5:35, 5 minutes early, the way it always seemed to when you were counting. The cones of the headlights faded from yellow to nothing as the world came up around them. The slough resolved out of the dark, the cattails, the black water, the broken dock that had been broken since before his time. He sat and watched the light come, and he did not trust it. Dawn on that road had always felt like a mercy, and it did not feel like one now. It felt like a curtain pulled back on a stage after the actor has already walked off, the set still there, the air still wrong, the proof of what had stood there present everywhere and nowhere a camera would catch it. At 10 of 6, the engine turned over on the first try. He did not understand it, and he did not question it. The starter caught, and the diesel rumbled up to its idle, rough, and then smooth, the gauges swinging up to where they belonged. The battery light dying out, and the machine that had been dead for 4 hours ran like he had only just shut it off for lunch. He sat with his hands on the wheel, and he listened to it run, and he did not put it in gear right away. He looked out at the road first, the gravel he had crowned himself, the windrow he had cut clean before the engine quit, and at the south shoulder where the thing had crossed, and he saw in the new flat light the place where it had stood. The prints were in the soft fill at the edge of the ditch where he had not yet graded, and they were deep, deeper than his own boot would press, deeper than the grader's own tires. And they were not a deer's. He had cast a bear track in plaster once for the Fish and Wildlife Office, a sow that had been raiding a calving barn, and he knew the round pad and the short claw marks of it, and this was not that. They were long. The shape of them held a heel and a long foot, and 4 spread points at the front, with the marks of the points sunk past where the toe ended. Claws that had pushed forward into the fill the way a man's toes push when he climbs a steep grade. He got down out of the cab, slow, with the hammer still in his hand, and he crouched at the edge of the ditch, and he set the 4-pound hammer down beside the nearest print for scale, and he looked at it. The print was longer than the hammer, He did not have a tape on him, and he did not need one to know it ran past 14 inches, heel to claw. There was no slippage at the edges, no smear, no scrabble, the way a track smears when a heavy thing is unsure of its footing. The fill had taken the weight clean and held it. He looked at the stride between them, the gap from one print to the next, and he did not measure that either, because the number was too far past anything that should walk. And he did not want it written in his own hand in his own notebook where Lila might one day find it. He took the grease pencil out and he stood over the prints, and he did not write the stride. He wrote one more line under the line. From the night before, prints at the ditch. 14-inch. Claws forward went toward the slough. He looked south where they led, toward the black water and the cattails and the broken dock, away from the road, away from town this time. And he stood alone.